כן, כן.
Good evening. Tonight's topic is parents, grandparents, grandchildren, and children. When I was 10 years old, on Leila Seder, I accidentally brushed against the tea kettle and scalded my back. I had a very extensive burn. And that night, I was writhing in pain. I lay on the couch, but I was not alone. My grandmother was by my side, applying creams, ice, and soothing me with her kind words. Several years later, when I was a college student, I was involved in a research project, which required me to visit perhaps the most dangerous neighborhood of Boston to interview women in their homes. And my bubby decided that she would come with me to protect me. God forbid something should happen to me. My bubby was a tiny woman, but she would take on whoever might come to harm me. Several years later, when I was already an attending physician, my bubby fell and broke her hip, and the doctors did not want to operate because of her advanced age. But I begged and pleaded, and thank God they did do the operation, and she enjoyed 10 more years of walking, enjoying her grandchildren and her great-grandchildren. When my mother, 37 years ago, was 28, 29 weeks pregnant with my sister, at a time when the world was not equipped to deal with premature babies the way it is today, she went into preterm labor. And the doctors explained to her that the situation was very serious. And they asked her, should we be aggressive? Should we try to save your child? And my parents insisted that they do everything in their power to save my sister's life. She spent 2 months in the neonatal intensive care unit and then was discharged home, at which point my parents set up a miniature neonatal intensive care unit in our house. They bought all of the equipment, they had all the medications, they even learned how to do CPR should the need arise. Thank God my sister matured into a beautiful, accomplished young woman, and en route to her college graduation, my father experienced pain in his left arm, which moved to his chest, and my brother, who was driving the car, quickly realized that he was having a heart attack. He turned the car around, drove through the streets of Boston at record speed, down one-way streets the wrong way, on the sidewalk, over a concrete barrier to get him to the hospital as quickly as possible. At the hospital, he wheeled him to the registration assistant. The registration assistant asked him his name. He didn't answer. My brother looked down and realized that my father was unconscious without a pulse. And he quickly rushed to get my father the proper medical attention. Now, these are just a few examples of efforts my family have made to promote the health and well-being among grandparents, parents, children, and grandchildren. And I'm sure that each one of you has your own examples of efforts that you've made to promote the healthcare among your family members. So tonight, I'd like to explore the question, does Halacha obligate us to promote the health and well-being of our family members, specifically grandparents, parents, children, and grandchildren? And this is a timely question at this moment in our lives, because we've just endured a year, more than a year, of COVID, which really compromised the physical and mental health of all three generations, and a year when it was almost impossible to promote the health and well-being of our family members. Guidelines restricted family from visiting the hospital, so parents and grandparents sometimes died alone without any family to be there for them. And it wasn't easy to support family that wasn't admitted to the hospital. Over 95% of deaths occurred in adults over the age of 50. And so older adults isolated themselves. But isolation comes at a tremendous psychological and physical price. Loneliness increases the risk of dying prematurely, of dementia, of stroke, of heart attack. For kids, this year wasn't easy either. Even though the risk of dying from COVID was much less for kids, kids had suffered major emotional distress. More than 75% of kids have said that they did not learn properly during COVID. Why? Because it's not easy to learn on Zoom, or it wasn't easy to learn in person due to the difficulties of social distancing and masking. The Ministry of Education in Israel reports that 30% of students didn't even participate in Zoom learning. And there also reports a significant decline in academic skills in students in grades 1 through 3, as well as English and math skills in children from grades 7 to 10. Also, a large percentage of children suffered psychological distress. There was a 25% increase in requests for suicide risk assessments in Israel. In Canada, more than 2/3 of kids suffered mental health issues. And similar results have been reported from all over the world: America, China, Brazil, the European Union. And what was the number one concern kids had? Well, the effect of the pandemic on their mental health and the effect of the pandemic on their families. The pandemic was also very challenging for parents of school-age children, because suddenly the parents turned into teachers responsible for making sure that the children participated in Zoom, that they completed their homework assignments, all while working without the help necessarily of grandparents, because grandparents couldn't visit. And for parents who with school-age children also caring for adult parents, the challenges were even greater. Now, over the last year, I've received many questions, intergenerational healthcare questions. Is it safe to visit my parents? Is it safe to hug my grandchildren? Is it safe for my daughter who's pregnant to receive the COVID vaccine? Is it safe for my grandchild? And now, with guidelines that allow vaccinated individuals to visit unvaccinated individuals, families are reuniting across Israel and across the United States in very moving scenes, some of which have gone viral. In a particularly popular video, a widowed mother visits her daughter for the first time in the year. And when she hugs her, she cries, "I've missed you so much." And at that moment, this widow receives her first hug, her first human touch in the last year. And so in light of all the challenges that we faced in the last year, which compromised the physical and emotional health of parents, grandparents, children, and grandchildren, and the challenges in promoting each other's health, it behooves us to determine how Halacha approaches these efforts we make to promote the health and well-being of our family members. So let's start with a parent's obligation to promote the health of a child. What exactly was the nature of my parents' obligation? Did they have an obligation to argue, to beg the doctors to save my sister's life, and to get her the best possible, this is Hebrew, to get her the best possible medical care? So, did my parents have an obligation to do this? And so the answer is yes, and there's several possible sources for this obligation. The first source comes from Mishlei. Al timna meinar musar. Do not withhold discipline from a child. And the Ralbag explains that this pasuk obligates a parent to prevent the premature death of a child. And by extension, if there's an obligation to prevent premature death, there's an obligation to keep the child healthy. But most poskim do not cite this as a source of a parent's obligation to promote the health of a child. Another source is Kiddushin 29a, which cites an opinion in the Mishnah that a father has an obligation to teach his child how to swim. Why might that be? Asked the Gemara. Chiyutehu, because his life depends upon it. Rashi explains it may be that the child will be on a boat and the boat will sink and the child will drown if he doesn't know how to swim. However, the Rambam and the Shulchan Aruch do not codify this obligation into law, most likely because they agree with the first opinion in the Mishnah, the Tanna Kama, who does not obligate a parent to teach a child how to swim. The Minchat Yitzchak, Rav Yitzchak Yaakov Weiss, the head of the Eda Haredit in Jerusalem from 1979, believes that the source of a parent's obligation to promote the health of the child is the parent's obligation to provide the child with food. Minchat Yitzchak was asked about a father who was quite poor, who had a son who was mentally retarded and also suffered from yisurim gufanim, physical suffering. And doctors had proposed a treatment that might reduce his suffering, but that treatment was expensive. And the father asked, am I obligated to beg for money, to raise the money for my child's treatment? Minchat Yitzchak answers, Hine pshita de chayav ha'av v'ripoi banav u'bnotav ha'ktanim, derefuah b'chlal mazonot, u'kmo shemitchayev b'refuat ishto. It is clear that the father is obligated to keep his child healthy, to promote the health of his child. Why? Because healthcare is part of feeding. And just as a father has an obligation to feed his child, he has an obligation to heal him. Feeding is synonymous with promoting health. And from where do we know this? From the husband's obligation to the wife. The husband is obligated to provide his wife with food. And part of that obligation is to provide her with healthcare. Minchat Yitzchak then quotes the Chatam Sofer, who was asked whether a father is obligated to provide health care for his 18-year-old daughter. And he answers that he is not obligated because the daughter's 18, suggesting that if the daughter were younger, he would have such an obligation. And then the Minchat Yitzchak goes on to bring a machloket, a disagreement between Rishonim, between the Ran and the Rosh, over the source of a father's obligation to provide food for his child. According to the Ran, the obligation is based on the father's obligation to provide food for the mother. According to the Rosh, the obligation to provide the child food is based on an independent obligation. What's the nafkamina between these two opinions? What is the practical difference between these two opinions? And so according to those who argue that the obligation to provide the child with mizonot is based on the father's obligation to provide the mother with food, if the mother dies, the father would no longer be obligated to provide the child with food. And secondly, the obligation to provide the mother with food has a negative commandment associated with it. She'ara uksuta va'onata lo yigra. And that negative commandment would obligate the father to beg for money, to raise money for the child's treatment. In the end, Minchat Yitzchak concludes that there is really no practical difference between these two opinions. And even those who argue that the father's obligation to give the child food is based on an independent obligation would obligate the father to beg for money, to raise money for the child's treatment. And then Minchat Yitzchak concludes by suggesting another source of the father's obligation to provide healthcare for the child. And that is lo tamod al dam rayecha, do not stand idly by. The Tzitz Eliezer also cites the father's obligation to provide food as the source of the obligation to promote the child's health and well-being. He was asked about the father's obligation to provide orthodontia for the child, which, mind you, is a preventive treatment. He's not asking about the father's obligation to promote the health of the child when he is short of breath and unable to breathe, when he requires treatment for an active disease, but treatment of a preventative disease. And the Tzitz Eliezer writes that ha'av chayav b'refuat banav b'oto midah shechayav b'mizonotehem derefuah b'chlal mizonot. The father is obligated to provide healthcare for his child based on his obligation to provide the child with food, because healthcare is synonymous with, is part of the obligation to provide food. And he quotes the Chatam Sofer as well as the Minchat Yitzchak. He explains that the father's obligation persists until the child is 18 years old, and the father may force the child to receive treatment till the age of 14 for a boy, 13 for a girl. And then he concludes by citing another source of the father's obligation to promote the child's health, and that is hashevota lo, the obligation to restore lost property, which includes restoring someone to health. And this obligation is timeless. It persists for the entire duration of the child's life and does not terminate when he or she reaches a certain age. So now we have some halachic parameters to understand what exactly my parents did for my sister. When my parents fought and advocated for her to receive the best possible care, they were fulfilling their obligation to promote her health and well-being, an obligation based on the laws of Mizonot, the obligation to provide her with food, as well as lo tamod al dam re'acha and b'hashevota lo, do not stand idly by, and the obligation to restore lost property. However, the tshuvot of the Tzitz Eliezer and the Minchat Yitzchak raise two fundamental questions. First, we know that the obligation to provide mizonot pretty much exclusively falls upon the mother. The mother does not appear to have an obligation in this mitzvah. And so the question is, what is the nature of my mother's obligation to promote my sister's health? Is there any basis of that obligation on the obligation to provide mizonot, to provide her with food? Secondly, all Jews have an obligation in lo tamod al dam re'acha and b'hashevota lo. And so is there something different about my parents' obligation in those mitzvot to promote my sister's health? Or is their obligation in lo tamod al dam re'acha b'hashevota lo the same as the rest of Am Yisrael? So let's start with the first question. When my mother fulfilled her obligation to promote my sister's health, was that obligation in any way based on her obligation to provide mizonot, obligation to provide her with food? After all, we said that obligation devolves exclusively on the father. Well, there are two circumstances when a mother might also have an obligation to provide her child with food, and by extension, for the purposes of our discussion, healthcare. What are those circumstances? If the father is not present, or the father lacks the financial means and the mother has the financial means. So what happens if the father is not available? According to the Rambam, if the father's not available and the mother is not interested in providing food for the child, mashlechat otan lakahal, the child is cast upon the community, becomes a ward of the state. The Ramach, Rav Moshe HaKohen from Lumil, who was a contemporary of the Rambam, is shocked by the Rambam. And he says, how can the Rambam not obligate the mother in this? If the father has an obligation to provide food for the child, then most certainly the mother must also have an obligation. How do we allow the mother to cast the child upon the community? And the Maggid Mishnah explains why this might be, because the father has certain obligations to the child that the mother does not. And so we can't possibly obligate her to provide the child with food if she doesn't have these other obligations. The Maaseh Rokach, Rabbi Elazar Rokach, chief rabbi of Amsterdam in the 18th century, takes issue with the Maggid Mishnah and explains that there's really only one mitzvah that the father has an obligation and that the mother does not, and that's teaching Torah. A mother is obligated to give tzedakah, and especially to her family members, especially to her children, because the children cannot go out and beg for money. And he suggests that maybe the Maggid Mishnah did not see the Ramach. And so now we have a circumstance when the mother might perhaps have an obligation to provide the child with food, and by extension, healthcare, because refuah bichlal mezonot. Healthcare is synonymous with providing food, and that's when the father's not available. The second circumstance when the mother might have an obligation to provide the child with food, and for the purposes of our discussion, healthcare, is if the father lacks the financial means, but the mother has the financial means. So Ktuvot Daf Nuntet Amud Bet presents a machloket, a disagreement between Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel over what happens if the mother takes a neder, she takes a vow not to feed the child. According to Beit Shammai, the mother may not be forced to feed the child. According to Beit Hillel, the mother may be forced to feed the child when she's married, because she has an obligation, it's part of her obligation to her husband. If she's divorced and no longer obligated to her husband, she may not be forced, because a mother inherently has no obligation to feed the child. And this, in fact, is the Rambam actually codifies this position into law, and the Mechokek supports the position of the Rambam. Now, the Ramah comments on this and says, quotes the position of Rabbeinu Yerucham, "Aval im ein lo kofeh oto minikato." If the father does not have the financial means, we may force the mother to nurse the child. Why? Because the mother must have some obligation to provide the child with food. The B'ni Ahuva, Rav Yonatan Eibeshitz, quotes the Ramah and quotes the Chalkat Mechokek and writes that Nir'ah devadai im ha'isha ashira af la'achar chavdal chodashim kofin et ha'em lazun baneha zaha kofin al tzedakah ve'ein lachat tzedakah yoter mizeh ve'im ken hi sheyesh la chalav b'didaha v'tochal lahanik harei hi ashira ladavar hazeh v'kofin ota kamosha kofin al kol tzedakah. That a mother who is wealthy, we force her to feed the child the same way we force her to give tzedakah, because there is no greater tzedakah than this. And this mother who has milk in her breast and can nurse the child, she is considered wealthy in this matter. And so we force her to feed the child just as we force her to give tzedakah. And the B'ni Ahuva suggests that we don't just define wealth by the amount of money that the mother has in the bank, but by the resources that she possesses. And here is a mother who has milk in her breast, which is a very important resource to the child. It's a critical resource, and so she has an obligation to feed the child based on the obligation to give tzedakah. The Ezer Mikodesh agrees with B'ni Ha'uva that yes, when the mother is rich, we force her to feed the child. Why? Because he mitzvah taseh shelo hazman grama. This is not a time-bound mitzvah. It's a mitzvah that a woman would have an obligation in. Yesh ba gam ken seder hahadraga l'hakdim hakarov la. And her family takes priority in performance of this mitzvah of tzedakah. Now, many poskim obligate women to provide mizonot for the child when she is wealthy and the father is not wealthy. However, Rav Shaul Yisraeli rules that a wealthy mother is obligated to provide mizonot for the child based on the obligation to give tzedakah, regardless of the father's financial status. And the Minchat Abraham agrees and explains that the reason that women weren't typically obligated in mizonot, that women didn't have the means, but a woman who has the means most certainly is obligated to provide mizonot from the laws of tzedakah. And for the purposes of our discussion, an obligation for mizonot translates into an obligation for refuah, for healthcare. And so now we can understand a little bit better what the nature of my mother's obligation to provide my sister with medical care was. Yes, her obligation. Yes, she has no obligation officially to provide mizonot, to provide my sister with food, unless my father is not present or lacks the financial means, and she has the financial means. Baruch Hashem, my father was present. He had the financial means to care for my sister, but my mother also had independent means to care for my sister. And according to Rav Yisraeli, a woman who is financially stable and is wealthy to provide care or to provide food, is obligated to provide the child with food, regardless of the father's financial status. In addition, B'ni Ahuva suggests that we define wealth not based on the amount of money in the bank account, but whether the individual possesses a limited resource, possesses a precious resource. And my mother, who was pumping milk for my sister, bringing it to the hospital every day, singing to her, hugging her, stimulating her, and nurturing her would most certainly be defined as ashira b'davar hazeh, and obligated in mezonot, and by extension, her healthcare, her refuah. But every mother, in theory, could be defined as ashira b'davar hazeh. Every mother could be defined as wealthy, because there is no replacement for a mother's nurture. A mother's nurture is critical in a child's development. And so a mother who has this resource would be obligated to give that resource, and by extension, it's obligated in the healthcare of their child. Both my parents, though, also had an obligation to promote my sister's health and well-being based on lo tamod al dam reyacha, do not stand idly by. But this mitzvah is incumbent upon all Jews. Every Jew has this obligation. And so that is my parents' obligation in lo tamod al dam reyacha, which is the basis for their obligation to promote her health and well-being. Is it somewhat different than the obligation of the rest of Am Yisrael? To sharpen the question, if I am standing on the edge of the Kinneret, and God forbid one of my children is drowning, and there are 20 other bystanders there, is my obligation to jump in and save my child different than my obligation of the other 20 bystanders? So the answer is yes. The Mishnah in Horayot, Daf Yud Gimel Amud Aleph, lists priorities for life-saving, priorities for triage. Who comes first, assuming that the chances of survival are the same, the level of risk between the people in danger is the same. Who comes first? So a Kohen takes precedence over a Levi over Yisrael, a Talmid Chacham over an Am Haaretz, and family takes precedence over non-family. Now, modern poskim do not typically rely on Mishnah and Horayot when it comes to triage. However, Rav Yaakov Emden explains that when it comes to Hatzalah, Kol HaKodem B'Nachala Kodem L'Hatzalah. When it comes to who you save first, whoever comes first in inheritance comes first for life-saving. And this is also the case for the laws of tzedakah, that family takes precedence over non-family. The closer the blood relation, the greater the obligation to save, the higher priority that individual has in life-saving. Why might that be? Well, Rav Moshe Weinberger, the Fox Schlesinger Center for Halacha and Medicine, has suggested that this prioritization reflects the words of Yeshayahu, Mivasarcha lo titalem, do not turn away from your family, which the Gemara in Ketuvot, Daf Nun Bet Amud Bet, explains obligates us to help our family members. Now, why? Why should we be obligated to help our family? Why? The closer the relation, the greater the obligation. The answer, he suggests, is chayecha kodmim. Your life takes precedence over someone else's life, and family members share a piece of us. We all share common DNA. The closer the relationship, the more DNA we share together, and the more the family member can be defined as chayecha. The closer the relation, the greater the obligation, because there's more of you in that person. And so when mothers have called me, a number of mothers have called me during COVID and said, should my daughter who's pregnant get vaccinated? And I typically will present all of the medical information, what we know about the vaccine and pregnancy, what we don't know. One mother in particular, after I finished explaining everything, turned to me and said, okay, now I have to be a nudnik and annoy my daughter and tell her all of this? And I explained, no, not to be a nudnik. You hear her concerns and then explain what we know and what we don't know in a non-judgmental way, but know that you are not being nudnik. You're exercising your chiyuv, your obligation of lo tamad al dam reyacha v'hashevot lo, mitzvot that you have an obligation to her for her entire life, and for which you have a greater obligation than anyone else on earth because of the closeness of your relationship. What about a child's obligation to promote the health and well-being of their parents? My brother heroically saved my father's life. Did halacha obligate him to do so? And the answer is yes. There are two elements to kibud av va'em. There's kavod and there's yira. And the Gemara in Kiddushin, Daf Lamed Aleph Amud Bet, asks, Ezahu kibud, how do we honor a parent? Ma'achil u'mashke, malbish u'machaseh, machnis u'motzi. You feed the parent, you give the parent what he needs to drink, you bring him clothing, you make sure he has shelter, you bring him in and you bring him out. And the Shulchan Aruch codifies these obligations of a child to a parent into law, but specifies that it must be done b'sevar panim yafot. It must be done with kindness. And who pays for all of this? Well, according to the Shulchan Aruch, the parent, unless, of course, the parent lacks the financial means, in which case the child may be forced to provide these actions for the parents. Now, the Shulchan Aruch Harav, So it would seem then that an integral part of kibud av va'em is providing parent with food, feeding them, giving them to drink. We've said refuah b'chal mazonot. Feeding is synonymous with healthcare. My brother clearly exercised his obligation of kibud av va'em, promoting my parents' health based on the obligation to provide food, and he performed these actions with hidur mitzvah on the greatest possible level. He also fulfilled his obligation in lo tamod al dam reyacha and v'hashevot lo, two mitzvot for which his obligation was particularly great given the closeness of his family relation. What about a grandparent's obligation to promote the health of their grandchildren? Does such an obligation exist? When my grandmother stayed up all night and nursed me back to health, did halacha obligate her to do so? Did halacha obligate her to follow me into the most dangerous neighborhood of Boston to protect me from thugs? So the answer is that a grandparent may have an obligation to promote the health of their grandchild based on several principles. Either an independent obligation to provide the grandchild with food, or an obligation to provide the grandchild food based on the law, the mitzvah of tzedakah. And we've already said refuah b'chal mazonot, an obligation to provide food translates an obligation to provide healthcare, or based on the obligation of a grandfather to teach his grandchild Torah, or the mitzvot lo tamod al dam reyacha and v'hashevot lo. So in halacha, we have a principle, b'nei banim harei hein kebanim. Children's children are like children. And this principle is based on the blessing that Yaakov Avinu gave to Ephraim and Manasseh. He blessed Ephraim and Manasseh with Ephraim and Manasseh, ki Reuven v'Shimon yuli. Ephraim and Manasseh will be like Reuven and Shimon to me. And Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer asks, Hello, b'nei banav hayu, aren't they his grandchildren? What does Yaakov come to teach us? Yaakov comes to teach us that one's grandchildren are like their children. And Masechet Yevamot, Daf Samach Bet Amud Aleph, cites this principle to prove that a parent who had a son and child who died, leaving a grandson and grandchild from each of those children, has fulfilled the mitzvah of pru'avu, to be fruitful and multiply. Why? Because b'nei banim harei hein kebanim. Grandchildren are like children. And the Rambam codifies this position into law. And so we've already established that, so if grandchildren are like grandparents, and a father is obligated to provide his child with food and by extension healthcare, and a mother under certain circumstances as well would have that obligation, is a grandparent obligated to provide a grandchild with food? This is a disagreement in the Gemara Yerushalmi. The Gemara Yerushalmi brings one opinion that says a grandfather has an independent obligation to provide the grandchild with food, and another opinion that the grandfather does not have such an obligation. And the Talmud Yerushalmi leaves this issue unresolved. But if in fact the grandfather has an obligation to provide the grandchild with food, by extension, he would also be obligated to provide the child with health care, because refuah bichlal mizonot. The Pitchei Tshuva quotes Chuta Sheni, who writes, Bnei banim einam kibanim li'inyan zeh, that grandchildren are not like children when it comes to mizonot, when it comes to not providing food. But nevertheless, the grandparent is obligated to provide the grandchild food from the mitzvah of tzedakah, a mitzvah that is incumbent upon women as well. And so if the grandparent is obligated to provide the grandchild with tzedakah, with food from the mitzvah of tzedakah, and we've already said that healthcare is synonymous with food, this would be a potential source for a grandparent to provide the grandchild with healthcare. Another potential source is the obligation of the grandparent to teach the grandchild Torah. Masechet Kiddushin Daf Lamed Amud Aleph asks, from where do we know that a grandparent is obligated to teach the grandchild Torah? And the Gemara answers from the verse, V'hodatem levanecha u'vnei banecha, make it known to your children and to your children's children. And because this pasuk is adjacent to the words, Yom Asher Amadas Alafanecha Hashem Elokecha B'chorev, the day you appeared by heart at Mount Sinai, Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi learns, Kol hamlamed et ben beno Torah ma'aleh alav hakatuv ki'ilu kibla mehar Sinai. That anyone who teaches his grandson Torah, it's as though he received the Torah on Har Sinai, which is a very powerful image, suggesting that when you sit down and teach your children, your grandchildren Torah, you are reenacting the giving of the Torah at Har Sinai. You are part of it. You are putting yourself into Jewish history. The Shulchan Aruch codifies this into law, that just as a parent is obligated to teach his child Torah, a grandparent is obligated to teach a grandchild Torah. And one is also obligated to teach his friend's child Torah. The Kesef Mishnah asks, well, what's the difference between the obligation to teach a child Torah, obligation to teach a grandchild Torah, the obligation to teach a friend's child Torah? And he explains that the child comes first, followed by a grandchild, followed by a friend's child, and that the parent is obligated to hire a teacher for the grandchild, as is the grandparent. But there is no obligation to hire a teacher for a friend's child. And so what happens if the father doesn't have the money to hire a teacher for his child? The Shulchan Aruch Harav obligates the grandfather to hire a teacher and to pay kol hotzaot Talmud Torah, all the expenses to make sure that this child learns Torah, because the grandfather is obligated to ensure that the child learns. And this is a very broad obligation. Kol hatzaot Talmud Torah. This obligation could potentially include the obligation to provide the grandchild with food, because a child who's weak can't possibly have the energy to learn Torah. And of course, from food would also include an obligation to provide healthcare. Very simply, Kol Hatzot Talmud Torah could include an obligation to provide healthcare, because a child who's sick could not possibly learn Torah. Now, I would like to just digress for a moment and take this opportunity to state that when I was growing up, I went to Maimonides School in Boston. The tuition was, like most American tuitions, quite expensive. And my parents had 5 children. And so I was fortunate to have my grandmother pay my tuition as well as my siblings' tuition. And I'm sure she did this purely out of a desire to help my parents, not realizing the extent of the mitzvah she had done, not realizing that this action put her at Mamad Har Sinai, brought her back to Mamad Har Sinai. And so back to the grandparent's obligation. A grandparent who gives his grandchild medicine on time when the grandchild needs medicine, a grandparent who takes the grandchild to the doctor, takes the grandchild for tests, grandparent who spends hours researching who is the best possible doctor to go to, where's the best possible place to bring the grandchild for medical care, especially when the parents aren't able to do so, is providing kol hotzaot Talmud Torah, all the expenses, all of the means to make sure that the grandchild can learn Torah, is potentially providing the grandchild, fulfilling the obligation to provide mizonot, which if such an independent obligation exists upon the grandparent, potentially fulfilling the mitzvah of tzedakah. And again, providing food is tantamount to healthcare because the two are synonymous. And the grandparent is also fulfilling his obligation, his or her obligation in lo tamar al dam rayacha and bahashevota lo. What about a grandchild's obligation to promote the health of a grandparent? When I advocated for my grandmother to have surgery to restore her to walking, did halacha obligate me to do this? And so we know that a child has an obligation to promote the health of a parent. And that is part of kibud ava'im. Does a grandchild have an obligation in kavod zakeno, an obligation to honor a grandparent, which would also include an obligation to promote his or her health? So the answer is, according to most poskim, a grandchild does have such an obligation based on the actions of Yaakov Avinu, based on when Yaakov Avinu brought a korban, and the text states that he brought a korban to the God of his father Yitzchak. And Rashi asks, what can we learn from the fact that he brought the korban to the God of his father Yitzchak and not the God of his father's father Abraham? And so the Torah comes to teach us, Yaakov comes to teach us, that one has a greater obligation to respect a parent than to respect a grandparent. However, there nevertheless is an obligation to honor a grandparent. Now, the Maharik argues no such obligation exists, and that a grandchild's obligation to the grandparent is the same as his obligation to a stranger. The Ramah, however, quotes the Maharik and disagrees. He writes, there are those who say there's no obligation to honor a grandparent. This is the Maharik. The Einon Nirali, I disagree. No, rather, the grandchild has an obligation to honor a grandparent, though this obligation is less than the obligation to honor a parent. And from where does he learn this? Rashi v'yizbach tzvachim. Taz agrees with Ramah that grandchild has an obligation to honor a grandparent, and suggests that maybe the Maharik did not see Rashi's interpretation. The Marsha sides with Maharik that there is no obligation to honor a grandparent. How does he deal with Rashi v'yizbach tzvachim? He suggests that one may not learn halacha from a midrash. However, there are two Gemarot that potentially support the position of Maharik that there is no obligation to honor a grandparent. And the first is from Makot, which describes a very bizarre set of circumstances where a father accidentally kills his child, and there's another brother who's still alive, and that surviving child cannot serve as the Goel Hadam, the avenger of blood, and kill the father. But if the father kills his son and there is a surviving grandchild, the grandchild may be act as the Goel Hadam and kill the father, which according to the Maharik proves that the grandchild has no obligation to honor a grandparent. Now, there are other ways to explain this Gemara, that the obligation to honor a grandparent is based on the obligation to honor a parent. When the parent dies, that obligation dissolves, and so the grandchild may serve as the Goel Hadam and kill the grandparent. But the problem with that is that we know that the obligation to honor a parent persists after the death of a parent. And so it's possible to explain the Gemara consistent with Rashi's understanding that yes, one is obligated to honor a grandparent, but the obligation to honor a parent is greater, and that is why the grandchild may serve as a Goel Hadam to avenge his father's death. His second Gemara, which potentially supports the position of Maharik, is Sota, which tells the story of Rav Acha bar Yaakov, who raised his daughter's son, Rav Yaakov. And Rav Acha bar Yaakov, the grandfather, asks his grandson to bring him a cup of water. The grandson refuses. He answers, Lav barich ana, I am not your grandchild, which, according to those in the Maharik camp, suggests the grandchild has no obligation to honor the grandfather. However, others have explained this as, yes, there is an obligation for a grandchild to honor a grandfather, but only a grandchild who is born from a son, not from a daughter. The Aruch HaShulchan rejects this understanding and says the grandchild is obligated to honor the grandparents, whether he was born from the mother or from the father. He explains the Gemara as consistent with Rashi, that when Rav Yaakov says, I love Barechana, I'm not your grandson, he means Ein alai lechavdecha kabein. I have no obligation to honor you like a son, but I nevertheless have an obligation to honor you. And the Aruch HaShulchan concludes by saying that if the father does not have the funds to provide mizanot, to provide food for the grandfather, then the grandson may be forced to provide food for the grandfather. Again, we said an obligation to provide food is synonymous with an obligation to provide healthcare. I have a dear friend who is truly a tzedekah. She brought her grandmother on Aliyah to Israel at the age of 95. When her parents were in America, and grandma moved in with her, and she took care of her, and she made sure that she had all of the medical care she needed. And this wonderful friend of mine fulfilled her obligation and kavod zakeno to honor her grandmother by caring for her, providing her with medical care, an obligation that was particularly strong because her parents weren't able to provide that care. In addition, she, in caring for her grandmother, she fulfilled the obligations of lo tamar al dam reyacha and v'hashivot lo. So in summary, Halacha obligates parents to provide healthcare for their children based on the obligation to provide food, which under certain circumstances devolves upon the mother as well, based on the obligation in lo tamar al dam reyacha and v'hashivot lo. Child is obligated to provide healthcare for the parent as part of Kibud Av Va'em, as well as Lo Tamar Al Dam Reyacha v'Hashevot Lo mitzvot, for which they have a particularly strong obligation given the closeness of the family relation. And a grandparent may have an obligation to promote a grandchild's health and well-being based on an independent obligation to provide food, or an obligation to provide food based on the mitzvah of tzedakah. And Refuah B'chal Mezonot, healthcare is synonymous with providing food, as well as an obligation to teach the grandchild Torah and pay for kol hatzaot limud Torah, all the expenses of learning Torah, especially when a parent can't provide, and mitzvot of lo tamar al dam reyacha and v'hashevot lo. A grandchild has an obligation to honor a grandparent and perhaps provide health care, though this obligation is less than the obligation to a parent. However, it is particularly strong when the parent is not available, as well as the obligation of lo tamar al dam reyacha and v'hashevot lo. COVID-19 has made it particularly difficult for families to fulfill these obligations, and poskim had to redefine the parameters of these obligations. And I'd just like to briefly summarize some tshuvot that appeared on this issue. So Rav Hershel Schachter was asked whether if guidelines prohibit a child from visiting a parent over Pesach, we're talking about a year ago Pesach, may the child refrain from visiting, or does this violate Kibud Av Va'em? And he ruled that the child may refrain from visiting, that the Kibud Av Va'em does not overrule healthcare recommendations, healthcare guidelines from the Ministry of Health. Yitzchak Zilberstein was asked about a father who was infected with COVID and was in quarantine, and asked his child to come and care for him while in quarantine. And the son asked Rav Zilberstein, must I go if taking care of him might endanger me? Rav Zilberstein ruled that the son was not obligated to go, that the obligation to care for one's health overrides or takes precedence over Kibud Av V'Em. However, the son was nevertheless obligated in Kibud Av V'Em and must ensure that there's someone to care for the father, that must ensure that the father's health is cared for. Rav Asher Weiss was asked about a father who forbade his son to vaccinate. And we're talking about an adult child with children of his own. And the son asked, may I nevertheless receive the COVID-19 vaccine? And Rav Weiss ruled that he may, because Kibud Av V'Em only relates to the actions that directly involve the parents, feeding them, giving them food, giving them drink, dressing them, but not to the child getting a vaccine. In addition, the vaccine is a mitzvah, and Kibud Av V'Em does not override the performance of this mitzvah. And finally, Rav Yosef Tzvi Rimon was asked about parents during the second wave who had been alone for quite some time and were very lonely. They missed their children, they missed their grandchildren, and they want the children and grandchildren to visit, even though it might endanger them. And so the son asked Rav Rimon, may I visit, knowing that the visit could kill them. And Rav Rimon begins by explaining, we have a mitzvah v'nishmartem ma'od l'nafshotechem, to protect one's health, but one may endanger oneself under certain circumstances for parnasa, for income. And even though loneliness is not the same as parnasa, as personal income, we know that loneliness can harm one's physical and mental health. And in addition, there is a halachic principle of shomer p'tayim Hashem. God watches over the simple. And so if the family masks and socially distanced, the family may meet, and not only may they meet, it would be a mitzvah to meet. And so Baruch Hashem, we have COVID-19 has receded, and we are at, and there's less infection, thank God. And we live in a time when life expectancy it has risen. 100 years ago, life expectancy was to live to the age of 50. Today, Baruch Hashem, the average age is 80, and which means that children can enjoy adult parents, and grandchildren can enjoy the benefits of being with grandchildren. And so I'd like to conclude with the words of David HaMelech, words with which my father ends every family celebration and Grandparents' Day with these words. He usually asks people to sing. I won't ask anyone to sing, but I will end with Urei Vanim Lefanecha Shalom al Yisrael. May you be worthy to see your children and your children's children. May you be worthy to promote their health care, their health and well-being. May we be worthy of peace for Am Yisrael. So I thank you for listening, and I'm very happy to answer questions.